Okay, this is me. I'm Casey. It'll be me throughout the presentation. I work for Basho in their professional services group. So I do a lot of proof of concept development, stuff like that. I also do on-site corporate training. My background with respect to this topic, I ran several user groups in the Northwest. I come from a Ruby background, like a lot of you do as well. I'm still co-organizer of the New York City Ruby meetup and a couple others. And now I also run Erlang PDX, the Portland, Oregon user group. Okay, so let's do a quick poll. This is going to be low-tech, show of hands. There's 5 choices. Figure out which one you fit in. Either you have no programming experience, no Erlang experience, you consider yourself a beginner, intermediate, or you're fluent in Erlang. So no programming? Okay. No Erlang? Okay, right on, decent. Beginner, intermediate, fluent? Okay, interesting spread, all right. So teaching and learning, why do we care? Maybe some of us don't care, but I'm going to be optimistic and assume that we all do. So I didn't realize that Francesco was going to be here, so I was quoting him from afar. But he tweeted not too long ago, "The biggest obstacle to the adoption of Airline in the Bay Area is the lack of programmers." So teaching and learning is about building up the Airline community. I'm of the ideology that humans are inherently social organisms. So more peers, more fellow programmers is more fun for us. It's also more income potential. So with respect to what Francesco is getting at here, you know, if you're a company and you want to develop an application, Erlang might be the right tool for the job. But if you don't think that there's enough of an applicant pool to cover your risk of developing something in Erlang, then the risk might be too high, right? So you might choose something that doesn't fit as well. So if learn you some Erlang for great good, then teach you some Erlang for fun and profit potentials. Okay, so that's why we care about teaching Erlang. My inspiration for this talk, 2 main things, misconceptions and Erlang solutions. Some misconceptions. There's a saying in the Ruby world that it's not a conference unless somebody quotes Zed Shaw. So actually, I think that's you up there, Yuri, the vague description of the tech. And then Zed Shaw replied, "Except Airline is very functional, not usable, hard to teach, and has some other stuff." And of course, this was on Twitter, so it kicked off a very thoughtful and well-metered debate on the pros and cons of functional programming. I just want to focus in on this one. Hard to teach. So I do hear this a lot, and we'll kind of address that. Here's another one, and I think you might have actually retweeted this. Erlang is designed for people who are willing to read the manual, which may be true, but does it need to be so hard? I think that's a reference to a couple things. Does Erlang need to be so hard? Does figuring out how to use it need to be so hard? And does managing your way through the documentation have to be so hard?
I interpreted that as Richard Keefe having a go at him saying, "Read the fucking manual."
Well, that too.
He has to do every now and then.
So I'm just focusing on the doesn't need to be so hard part. That's a very difficult question to answer. I have good news for you, though. I have the answer, so I can just tell you, and then you have it. The answer is no. It doesn't have to be so hard. So that's my first inspiration for this talk, clearing up some of the misperceptions, misconceptions around Erlang, around teaching it, and around learning it as a new language. And my second inspiration was Erlang solutions. So I was introduced to Erlang at the London factory last year. Robert Verding was just a fantastic introductory teacher. I took a second course from Francesco, and they really have their shit together teaching Erlang. So I was kind of inspired by that to reinterpret and extend the way that they teach at Airline University functions. So I'm going to go through 3 sections: adult learning, teaching programming, and then kind of drill down into teaching Erlang. Adult learning. It's a huge field. And it's kind of like an early field in scientific terms. So there's a lot of problem areas that aren't entirely figured out, how the academic environment is going to respond to them. E-learning kind of threw traditional academia for a loop. I imagine it'll be many years before any of this approaches anything like resolution. But there's 3 principles of adult learning that I want to focus on, and then I'll come back to repeatedly. Relevance, consilience, and reflection. So again, there's many principles of adult learning, many different methodologies for understanding adult learning. I'm just going to focus on these 3. Relevance, consilience, and reflection. So the first one is relevance. Basically, the way our brains work, when you learn something new, you're building incrementally on knowledge that you already have. So if a concept has no footing, it won't stick. That's why metaphors are so important for teaching. I remember back in the web consulting days, everything was related to building a building, you know, an architect creates blueprints, blah, blah, blah. Well, the metaphors are actually there for a reason, and that's that the information that comes across has some footing to stand on. You can't build on a foundation if you don't know the audience. That's why I did a quick poll. I'm going to adjust the content a little bit based on your experience levels, although that's hard because it seems like we have the opposite of what usually happens. You're on both ends of the spectrum. But that's not enough. So to know where a particle is, you have to also know its velocity, right? So relevance, you have to take into account motivation. What's your motivation for, in this case, learning a programming language or learning Erlang? It kind of reminds me of a lot of software developers, software engineers that I know don't have a traditional academic background in computer science. And I attribute a lot of that to the fact that in most higher ed here in the States anyway, almost everything is taught in Java. And so there's a lot of relevancy mismatch there between the students and what they're trying to teach and how they approach teaching. So there's the problem of, does Java actually fit things that, the experience that people come into a CS program with? That's debatable. But there's the bigger question of, does it fit with their motivation and the other things that are relevant to them? And the answer there is probably not, unless they really like to type, right? So when it comes to relevance, if what you're talking about doesn't match the experience level of the audience, they can actually consciously tune out. So the next point is, the next principle of adult learning that I want to touch on is consilience. Consilience is when knowledge reduces under unifying principles. So if I present a conclusion to you that doesn't jive with the other things that you know, or that you think you know, then you'll just reject it out of hand. So if I'm trying to tell you something that doesn't fit with your current knowledge base, consciously or not, you're going to have a very difficult time integrating it. Politics in the United States is a great example. There's this strong division between liberal and conservative, and it corresponds well with media divisions. So somebody who is raised on Fox News will hear a liberal person say something to them, and they're like, oh, you must be an idiot. How could you possibly think that? And vice versa. I don't know what the Fox News equivalent for the liberal side is. Maybe NPR, National Petroleum Radio. I don't know. So somebody on the other side. And it's not that either person is stupid. It's that they already have a knowledge base built on certain facts. And when something else is presented that doesn't jive with that, there's literally no path in a neural network to integrate that information. So it's going to get rejected out of hand. Keep that in mind when you hear people talk about learning Erlang and functional versus object-oriented programming. Okay? There's a distinction there that might not need to be there. And the third principle of adult learning that I want to talk about, that I want to touch on, is reflection. So without time for reflection, concepts don't stick for adults. It's different for kids. But 25 minutes is about the amount of time before adults start dropping packets, so to speak. Okay? It makes a format like this kind of awkward, right? I have 45 minutes, and even the best, most energetic of you, most Buddhist Zen-like, able to focus your own mind, can't really hold concentration longer than 25 minutes. Presentations are generally a terrible format for teaching something. Question and answer is okay. That's a form of external reinforcement. So if you're giving a presentation or a lecture and you go on 25 minutes, then you stop, you take questions and answers, that's fine. That's a good way to break and let people reflect. But you can't give them new information. It'll just start falling off the other end of the queue. Okay, so those were the three principles I touched on: relevance, conciliance, and reflection. And here's where I'm going to show my commitment to my ideology, break up the format just a little bit. I don't want to get I don't want to make you guys too uncomfortable, but I'm going to break it up a little bit. And when I come back, I'm going to talk about teaching programming in general, but I'm going to take 60 seconds. So if you guys have any questions, that's fine. I encourage you to stand up. I'm going to start talking again in 60 seconds. Yep.
Just a comment. One of the things that I experienced in university when the subject of teaching programming came up was that the perception is if you teach programming, universities aren't vocational schools, right? You get that a lot. Is a very, I don't want to say contempt, but there's a lot of resistance in the culture against that, because I think people feel the Java is sufficiently distributed so people can pick it up. It's fairly straightforward. It's meant for teaching, it's used for teaching concepts in computer science. Whether that's a good programming practice or you're designing something good is a totally different story, right? You just don't have the time.
So I'm going to repeat your point so that this camera picks it up, or this microphone. I'm wired like a Borg here. So the point is that there's an attitude in academia that it's not vocational, so maybe you shouldn't be focusing on vocational considerations when you teach programming. The problem there is that computer science has the word science in it, which means it's not really, right? Anything with the social science, these things aren't really science. So if they were teaching computology, maybe I'd believe them. But right now, particularly in the world that we live in, and I'll make this point too. So I have a paper that was just accepted for a publication, and I work full time. So, who's to say they're exclusive? But I'm sure every generation has had an opportunity to say this. But in this economic situation, I think most of us want to at least have that occupational pillar covered. And we can practice the fun academic stuff on top of it. So I think their priorities are backwards. Okay. So I touched on principles of adult learning. Now I'm going to go over teaching programming. In 3 parts. Review of existing methods, say a little bit about experiential learning, and then something called star games. So existing methods, and I think these are mostly the kind of thing that Zed was talking about. So books, lectures, talks, and presentations, like this. They're unidirectional, by and large, right? So I can throw stuff at you, but it's very difficult for me to get feedback. The problem with that is that relevancy, right, is then a shot in the dark. It's really difficult for me to customize the content to make it relevant to you. to make it relevant to your motivation, your experience level. Conciliance is also based on assumptions. When you pick up a book, there's some pre-selection bias there. So you assume that, okay, there's, a programmer is picking up an intermediate programming book on Erlang, right? So there's assumptions that we come from similar backgrounds, and that's good. That makes it more applicable. However, it also limits our diversity, right? So there's some drawbacks to that as well. And depending on the format, like these lectures, we don't allow time for reflection, right? Book you can put down, but the rest is typically paced. The other problem with these that is particular to something like teaching a skill is that it's really difficult to tell a story that helps teach a skill. So I can tell a story that presents data, right? Like the presentation releasing the research on Higgs boson. That's a really complicated topic, but there was already audience selection bias there. So presenting the data was actually really easy. If they instead tried to explain how they figured out what the EV of the Higgs boson was, that would be a hell of a lot more complicated. So it's true for concepts too. Explaining something in this kind of format, a skill that you have to learn, is really difficult to do in one of these formats. It's a little bit easier with one of these formats. Tutorials, code katas, Code Academy is I'll just put that up there as an example, living in this same kind of vein. Basically, these present users with a task. Actually, I think it was at Airline Factory Lite, somebody pointed out that there's only one other industry that refers to their customers and clients as users. So we present our users with a task, and we basically have them repeat it. Sometimes we have explanations, right, with tutorials. These stick better, right? But they're not entirely the answer. So these are better formats for teaching a skill than, say, a book, which is going to present you with data. They touch on this, experiential learning, which, it's what it says. It's basically a concept that you can only learn something, or some things you can only learn by doing them. And the important thing to note from our point when we're teaching something is that there's interesting ROI implications for experiential learning. If you actually have a forum where people are doing the thing, or you can simulate people doing a thing that you want them to learn, then you have a basis to construct ROI to determine whether or not they actually did it. We were talking earlier about certification. Certification tests are a perfect example. Teach somebody something, then have them take a test. There's kind of a new spin on this recently. It's died off a little bit the past year, but gamification, which for those of you who aren't familiar, gamification is when you basically exploit psychological effects of small frequent rewards and occasional failures to get people to complete a task. So it encourages repetition and motivation, or task completion, really, if somebody's going through a tutorial or going through some learning format. It doesn't necessarily encourage retention, though. So it can make things fun. So the psychological effects are actually really interesting. If I had a lottery where you come to me, I sell you a ticket for $1, you don't win. Second ticket, you don't win. Third ticket, you win $1. Okay, and then that repeats forever. You'd get a higher return than you would with most lotteries, but you'd probably stop playing pretty quickly because it's not fun. It's kind of weird, right? So you buy 20 tickets, the first 12 have nothing, the 13th you win $4. Suddenly you're the guy who figured out how to beat the system, right? And you come back and you play, and people do, and that's why lotteries work. So there's this randomness of, you know, small rewards of getting something, and they get a bigger reward, and then they get failures and failures and failures. But as long as they keep getting just enough reward to string them along, then it keeps them engaged. Again, it can help with task completion, but doesn't necessarily help with retention.
Is there an age-related component? Like, is it work the same in all ages, or does it have different effects? Because I see a lot of children.
Children can focus on gamification longer than adults, and it's not clear whether or not that's a cultural bias. So learning something, actually, believe it or not, is painful. It actually causes your brain to feel pain. And children, because they have to learn so much, they have a much higher tolerance for that pain. So it's easier for them to, you know, learn whatever, 1,000 words a day, whereas for us to learn the meaning of a new word, one new word a day, is sometimes very difficult. That's one of the reasons. Children are also presented with language much different than adults, but that's another story. You might be able to learn Spanish faster if somebody presented it to you as baby talk Spanish. Good luck hiring somebody to do that. It's an interesting picture. So star games. So at the user groups that I ran, I basically tried everything that I could implement at my user games that I heard of. I would try. So presentations, sometimes like this, sometimes more lecture format, tutorials, big name speakers, hackathons, install fests, watching videos, teleconferencing, debates, panels, code reviews, anything I heard about that sounded interesting happening at a user group, I was like, okay, let's try that. And after about 1.5 years, 2 years, I came up with a format that was a little bit of a hybrid, and it's evolved a lot over the years, but this is what I call it. So I call it star games. The star can be any programming language. So there have been JavaScript games, Ruby games, Airline games, Python games, not PHP games. Dear Lord, please not PHP games. So Star Games is a facilitated experiential learning system. So how do we start? We start by teaching some concept. So say in programming you want to teach array manipulation or regexing or file parsing. It doesn't really matter what. It's really just some form of programming. And we want to get in there some best practices. I'm one of the people that you make fun of sometimes. I'm kidding. So craftsmanship is kind of something. It's a meaningless word, but on the object-oriented side and object-oriented background, personally, I've found it important working with teams and switching teams often to have a couple best practices kind of drilled into people's brains. One of them is test-driven development. If you're working on a distributed team or a team with high turnover, test-driven development is kind of a no-brainer. Another one is paired programming. Now, for this, I consider it a best practice for learning experience because I think learning is a human interaction. I'm not going to argue that this is a best production or development practice. That, I think, is entirely dependent on the company culture and what you're trying to do. But when you're learning paired programming works great. It's great to be able to rubber duck while you're solving a problem, if nothing else. Peer review. So not only being a principle of Western science, computology, right? It helps you build conventions, and conventions are necessary for community. I would argue they are actually necessary. They are a necessary condition for building up community. And again, as I argued at the beginning, I want to help build the airline community. Algorithmic communication. I don't mean an algorithm that can communicate. I mean being able to communicate about an algorithm. If you can't communicate about it, then it's doubtful that you can reason about it in certain ways that are very useful in software programming. So that's why I consider it a best practice. Refactoring, because everybody should have learned how to clean up after themselves. Constructive problem solving. Constructive problem solving? Okay, so there's a question here because not everyone is good at this, and I'll come back to that. And so I'm a little bit on the fence about whether this is something that should be included as kind of a best practice we're shooting for. And the other one is competition. So when I run user groups on the East Coast, competition is vital. If it doesn't have competition, then you're wasting your time. So I brought that attitude to Pasadena, and it didn't go over so well. So on the West Coast in the United States, competition doesn't have as much cultural value. So it has more a dubious place in best practices. So I think it's culturally dependent. In Portland, it's kind of there's a mix, and in San Francisco, well, they import all of their talent, so it depends on where they come from. So star games. I'll describe the process. First thing I do, usually this is a user group format. If there's more than 24 people, then I either have to jointly facilitate with somebody else. I have to facilitate with somebody else. So 24 people or less is kind of the cutoff. So we go around the room and we do introductions. And they can say their name, where they're from, why they want to be there. That's fine. What I'm making notes about, I actually make notes about their relative experience level. Okay? Next thing I do is I inverse pair them. So if I know them well on a personal basis, I can take personality into account. But with a new group, that's not possible. So I pair the most experienced person, in this case with the most experienced with Erlang, with the least experienced person, somebody who's never programmed before. Okay? And zip that. Then I provide a test in code. So in Ruby, everybody's written their own test framework, so it can look like whatever. In Erlang, it's eUnit, and so on. QUnit in JavaScript usually works well. And then I facilitate the solution of a test. So again, if competition is involved, the pairs are competing on some principle, right? So they make the test pass with the most clever algorithm, or the fastest, or the most interesting in some respect. But if not competition, then they're just helping each other get through this. So in pairs, with a less experienced person driving, they're doing the typing. I first ask them to before they start typing, figure out what algorithm they want to implement to pass the test. Then they start doing that, and my job as a facilitator is to go around and make sure that they don't hit any stumbling blocks, or that they do hit stumbling blocks, but are then able to get over them. And then I facilitate interruptions. So every 25 minutes or less, I make them all stop, interrupt them, and I'll generally review some of the direction that they're going with the algorithms that they're working on. And other than that, I'll answer questions and kind of give them at least 5 minutes to where I encourage them to not think about the problems, that when they come back to it, they have some learning about what they've been typing so far, right? So now people who show up to a user group, a lot of times it's, I'm not a programmer, I'm just here to watch. No, by the time they leave, they're already software engineers, right? We can already hire them. They're already software engineers. They're already programmers. They've already typed some code, and they've got it working. They have an experience with paired programming. They've been introduced to it through test-driven development. And universally, I get the highest positive feedback from this format than any of the others that I've mentioned at user groups, and now even corporate training sessions. Okay, people like this format. So star games, teaching programming, these are the three things I touched on. Existing methods, the experiential learning aspect of it, and the format of star games. So I'm going to do the same thing again now, 60 seconds, where I'm not going to talk about this unless you guys have questions. Yep.
So basically, you implemented Fight Club. This is your first time, you have to fight.
Yeah, and for years we didn't talk about it. So.
What sort of game would you pick for us?
For like this group?
So Erlang, of course.
Yeah, an Airline one.
But what would it be?
It would be a simple problem. Something, you know, you can pick them up offline, but I'll get into examples of that in a minute too. Yep.
So I'm curious about interruptions. So do you find that people new to a language handle interruptions better? Because I know, at least in my experience, like I want to stay focused, and if I get interrupted, then that's pretty disruptive to my process.
Actually, I find it's very much personality dependent. And at times I literally have, you know, okay, guys, stop, hands off the keyboard. Yeah, so that happens. I find it's, as I've run this, so for example, at the New York meetup, I've run several iterations of games. So some of those people are the same people. And I find that the people who have difficulty handling certain aspects of the games consistently do. So I think it's a personality or background consideration. Okay, so I'll move on to the third and final part, which is applying that specifically to Erlang. Looks so pretty up there, teaching Erlang. So I'll touch on some special considerations for Erlang versus other languages. I'll give you an example of Airline games, and I'll come back to your question about specifically what kind of games I would suggest for a crowd like this. And then talk about how that has worked out in practice. I hear this a lot, or something like it. Learning functional programming is fundamentally different from learning object-oriented programming. That's bad. That is a very, very bad thing to say. So again, Conciliate, as a principle of adult learning, says that the new things that you learn have to jive with what you already know. And you're building incrementally on the things you already know. So this kind of just is entirely contrary to Conciliate with somebody's knowledge base. It's bad, and we don't like doing bad things, so let's not do that. Functional versus object-oriented, it's an academic distinction. If somebody's already an experienced functional programmer and somebody else is an experienced object-oriented programmer, and they want to debate that in an academic sense, that's fine. I think that enriches the community. That's good for both sides because they both already understand what they're talking about. But when you approach somebody who's trying to learn a programming language with this distinction, you're setting up part of their brain to shut off before you even begin to try to cram information in there. It's also irrelevant to learning. It just doesn't. I mean, never do I sit down programming and go, okay, I'm going to do this functionally. That's how I'm going to solve this problem. No, if you're working in a functional language, of course that's how you're going to do it. If you're in an object-oriented language, of course that's how you should do it. So whenever you hear this, and we get excited about Erlang and the features that set it apart from other languages, the excitement's good, but a lot of people who we're approaching as a community, a lot of the message that gets conveyed is this is unlike anything you've ever learned before. And again, I just have to reiterate, that is bad. Nowhere does it help to learn something and hear this first. There's that just, you're never going to learn something well where the person teaching it to you says, okay, get ready, I'm going to blow your mind with something that's like inconceivable to you. Okay, so Consideration for Erlang when you're teaching Erlang, don't start off by saying, it's so special, it's so different, it's going to blow your mind. The excitement part, great. The different part doesn't help when you're teaching. This has been referenced a couple times before, the syntax and aesthetics. And this is one of the most common things I hear from people who bought Joe Armstrong's book and maybe tried it, but kind of backed off. They say, oh, well, the syntax is complicated, or I didn't like it, or some opinion about it. What's really interesting about that is the people who enjoy Erlang tend to say that this is one of their favorite things about it, right? It's one of the things it's one of my favorite things about the language anyway. So here's a different way of presenting this, right? Really simple Erlang example here. I don't have anything to point with, do I? Yeah. Yeah, I think I would have to climb up in the middle to get my shadow there, so I'll just point. So, code. And if you don't know code, like, blur your eyes and try to remember when code didn't make sense to you, right? The best way that I've found to start presenting this to somebody who isn't a coder or who isn't an Erlang coder, or maybe has already been turned off by the, oh, it's functional, it's so different, it's a different mindset, is we start with this, it's like a sentence, okay? We got a subject up there, factorial 0. It doesn't matter what it is, that's a subject, right? And then something happens, semicolon, right? We know what semicolons are. It's a clause and then another clause, right? They're similar. They reference the same kind of subject, right? So we got something about that subject and another something about that subject and then a period. Okay? When you brace out a sentence like that, it's really helpful because people already know how to scan for semicolons and periods. So then when you present them with a bigger chunk of code, they go, and you go, no. Just subject, and then find the period. Okay? Okay. They're already on safer ground. Then you can start with, yeah, okay, so the first one, subject and the period, and so it's about format, and then it does something, and it returns that value. And the second one, it's also about format. In this case, is a different kind of format because it has different options. But it does something, comma, does something else, comma, does something else, comma. So it's just doing things. And then when it's done, down here is the period. So you know that that's what it returns. Okay? Any Erlang block of code now, they can go apply that to that block of code. Same thing. Here's an example with commas and semicolons. Again, we're already predisposed to reading sentences. We're already predisposed to look for that punctuation. So don't fight it. Address it head on, explicitly. You don't have to give your opinion about whether you like it aesthetically or not. And the human brain will pick it up faster. They'll be able to parse the code quicker. They'll be much less intimidated by a large block of code, because they can at least find subjects and know where the sentences end. Another special consideration when teaching Erlang is all of the jargon. So concurrency, parallelism, multi-stuff. This is good to know when you're building applications, obviously, and software engineers should understand these principles, and but leave that until after they already understand how to program simple stuff. Right? So again, this is where we get really excited about something that makes our lives easier, that we really enjoy doing, and so we try to cram it on somebody, and it's like showing somebody else your vacation photos. It's so fascinating to you, and you just can't understand why they don't want to sit there and soak in. No offense to anyone who's shown vacation photos recently. Note on processes. I can't do this better, so if you Google a visual tour of Airline, he has a fascinating visual depiction of how Erlang starts processes, and basically there's like a 3D rendering of processes and how they relate to each other, and you kill a process. Yep.
3 minutes.
Okay. And so that's really great, so go look at the video. All right, I'm going to show you a quick example of an Airline games that I've used recently. So this is a gist, so I'll just have people copy this down. And okay, the stuff at the top isn't important, it just includes eUnit and some stuff. Then roots test, this is our test, right? We got 4 assertions. The first one is that we're going to pass roots, the function roots, 21, and we expect it to return an array of a 3 and a 7. Okay, we're just finding prime roots of numbers here. Second one, we give it that larger number, it comes back with those 2 roots, and so on. Here you can see I implemented code that passes those tests. Okay, and if they have time, then there's a timer function down here, so you can, the competitive people can battle out whose algorithm is faster. So their job in pairs is to get rid of that and return code that actually does it. And you can see the 4 tests get increasingly difficult for a variety of reasons. But yeah, that's a great problem. Super simple on the face of it, but there are so many ways to solve that problem that you can easily spend, I've had sessions go more than 2 hours on a simple problem like that, where everybody is involved. So in practice, other people have run Ruby games in all throughout New England, New York, Southern California. I've done many. I have found that it's difficult to train other facilitators. Choosing the problems, not too hard to do if you know what you're looking for. You don't want, it's not about solving a hard problem in computation. It's about giving them a problem that's easy enough to grasp, but there's many different ways of solving it. And when you're facilitating, of course, you kind of have to be an expert on this problem. What happens is you anticipate where people, so that problem, for example, people who have a computer science background tend to congregate towards a hash map solution. I'm sorry, no, I'm thinking of it right. So for roots, interesting thing about roots is that people who are heads down coders, hyper-focus, right? They have a more difficult time communicating about a problem like roots, particularly if they don't have a background in math. The most experienced software engineers can give me the most initial friction about getting started, because they just want to do something, they want to spike it, and they don't want to be slowed down by somebody who doesn't know how to solve it. They get over that pretty quickly, generally, but everybody else has a much easier time jumping in that pool. Time flies when you're doing this, and when you're presenting on it. Seriously, hours can go by on a simple problem like that. People will continue to post on it throughout the night. And yeah, so the reception has been very good. I've gotten very good ROI feedback on it. That's my presentation. That's the things I touched on: adult learning, teaching programming, specifically teaching Erlang, and that's still me. Any questions? Do I have time for questions?
Can we take it during the break?
We'll take questions during the break. Thanks, guys.
After the beer.